Hey, this week we're joined by Mike Milinkovich, the director of the Eclipse Foundation, but not to talk about IDEs. This time, it's the Cyber Resilience Act out of the European Union, a well-intentioned law that may have some serious ramifications for all of us. You do not want to miss this one, so stay tuned.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 728, recorded Wednesday, April 19th, 2023. Open season on open source.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed, with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit, and thanks for your support.
Bonjour, bonsoir, or wherever it is, wherever you are. I am Doc Searls. This is FLOSS Weekly, and our guest is smiling because he's in Belgium, and he speaks at least one of the native languages there. But we're not bringing him on yet. We're going to build suspense while I don't bring him in. Ant brings him in, our producer, Jonathan Bennett from Oklahoma.
Yes, the flyover country. Makes
the flyover country.
Go by. We enjoy it, though.
I like flyover Oklahoma. I used to look at Indiana as a flyover state, but now I live there too. So, but right now I'm in the most reverberant room in downtown, or what used to be downtown Silicon Valley. I'm in the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. I have Bayview here right now. I'm not going to turn the computer around and show you because it's just trees. I can turn a little bit. You see, there's a mirror there. Oh, that's reflecting a door. Oh, well. But yeah, I'm in Silicon Valley here at a conference where you can tell I'm at a conference because I have a name badge. Here we go. And it's one that I helped put on. I started it, actually. The Internet Identity Workshop to solve Internet identity. We're on our 36th so far because we'll never solve it. We have 2 a year, and it's impossible. So everybody comes.
One of those problems that'll never be done.
So how are you doing there, Jonathan? You're kidful now. You have like 3 kids.
Yeah, I've got 3 of them running around, and it's sort of a handful, but we're doing well. Everybody's doing pretty well. Got a couple of little things going on that we're trying to get worked out as far as health goes, but making really good progress.
Well, there's the good thing about having a number of kids. Between my wife and I, we have 4 that are all older adults than you in 3 of the cases. Possibly older than our guest as well, but is that you think you've got it down. A quick one, my youngest, my 2 oldest, I had potty training worked out. You guys know how to do this now. We're going to sit in the bathroom until you do it. Okay, there's the throne. We're going to do this. And it worked out with them. With my youngest, who could already walk and talk, like at 9 months, and was tall as well, so reached everything. And he voluntarily went in and used it and showed off. And I thought, oh my God, we set a record, we're done. And then he decided he'd go in his pants for the next 3 years. And he was insistent about it. So you never know.
That's about right.
And if he's watching, he'll kill me. But there you go.
Of course.
So did you do any homework on this one, Jonathan?
So I have, in a way. This is actually one of the stories that I have been following and doing a little bit of writing about too. And we're kind of going to break a rule because it gets sort of political, but it's important enough that, boy, we really need to talk about it. And that is what happens when the government swoops in and tries to fix cybersecurity. And
I think you and I are of one mind on this already.
That statement terrifies me.
But
I'm going to try not. We're going to try not to get too terribly political about it and actually stick to the facts. But I like what Robert Graham said. It's kind of like Homer Simpson walking in as the safety guy at the atomic plant and saying, safen up, you. And so our government has walked in and is pointing at all of us and going, secure up, make secure software.
Oh my God, I know. There's a guy here at this conference at the Internet Identity Workshop better known as IW, who is, I just the NSA. He's from one of the government agencies, and he's been here before, and he says, I'm from the government, and I'm actually really here to help and to listen. And talking to him, you get this. With this guy, it's true, but how many others are there? So it's a little scary. Yeah. Well, let's get down to it. So our guest is Mike Milinkovich, who Simon Phipps, who introduced us and would be on the show today, and for all I know, may call in at some point. He's dealing with some personal issues, unfortunately, but he was very excited about this. Mike is the longtime executive director of the Eclipse Foundation and deeply informed on the Cyber Resilience Act, which Jonathan and I were just talking about in Europe, which, by the way, now means the world. Like, the GDPR, we're all dealing with that. The CCPA, we're all dealing with that, and is also has an emerging position in the U.S. He's running one of the most consequential software nonprofits in the world. So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Your background is blurred, but you're not. That's good.
Yeah.
And do I have it right? You're in Belgium somewhere at this point, or?
Yeah. So I'm in downtown Brussels, about 300 meters away from the headquarters of the European Commission as we speak.
So I may be presumptuous in saying this, but you just said a boot, so I'm thinking you're from Canada. Is that right?
I am. I said about, not boot, but
you haven't heard the boot, man. You can't conceal that.
Yeah. No. I'm a native Canadian, and I still my main base is Ottawa, Canada. That's where my family and I live. But I spend an awful lot of time in Europe because you mentioned earlier that you've got some background with the Eclipse Foundation and you have some of the history, some of the history there. But the Eclipse Foundation is actually now the largest open source foundation from Europe. We moved our legal domicile to Europe 3 years ago. And we are firmly a European organization now. So that's actually something, and that's part of the reason why I've become so familiar with the ins and outs of the Cyber Resilience Act, is because you've probably heard this old joke about the difference between involvement and commitment. When you sit down for breakfast and you have your bacon and eggs, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. And so the Eclipse Foundation is committed to Europe, and so however the Cyber Resilience Act evolves, we're here to interpret it and make it work as best as we can for Europe. And so that's a little tiny bit of background on the Eclipse Foundation. We're actually we are one of the largest open source foundations in the world, but we're definitely the largest open source foundation in Europe and from Europe. And we have staff right now. We're about 65 people, about 32 of which are in Europe. We've hired 8 people in Europe just since January 1st. The move to Europe has worked out really well for us as an organization, and we've been, over the last couple of years, we've actually now become the home or the steward of some of the most consequential open source projects in Europe related to initiatives that are very important to Europeans, such as, you hear phrases like digital sovereignty and the like, and data spaces. You might have heard of things like Gaia X or digital twins, these kinds of things, Industry 4.0. The open source projects that are in behind each one of those strategic initiatives for Europe have found a home at the Eclipse Foundation.
So I wanted to go back over, just touch this much on Eclipse, because I was an editor for Linux Journal for 24 years. And early in that, or maybe sort of toward the middle of it, because it's a long time, around the turn of the millennium, IBM very publicly got involved with Linux and got involved in open source. And it was a really, on the one hand, it was like a brilliant strategic move, but really they were following their own engineers, because their engineers said, we're all on Linux here, guys. We just adopted Samba in 10 million old PCs, and that are now doing file and print, running on open source. So, but they they bragged about we're spending $2 billion on Linux, which is no way, or on open source without really specifying how that was. But a big part of that was where they turned over to the Eclipse Foundation. They formed the Eclipse Foundation to basically be the house for some of the stuff they were already, what that was. So if you could just go back to that, just so I'm up to date on how that's evolved from the start.
Yeah, so, well, there was two big bets that IBM placed way back in the day, and the one that you're most familiar with is Linux. But in addition to that, there was Java was another big bet. And one of the issues that they identified in the Java ecosystem was they didn't, compared to what Microsoft had with Visual Studio, Java didn't have great tools for developers. And so the original, the brand Eclipse, when you talk to a lot of developers today, they still associate that with the Eclipse IDE, the integrated development environment that was super popular amongst Java developers, and also C and C++, PHP, and the like. And so Eclipse was the home of the original Eclipse project, just like Apache started with the Apache project and then became a home for a multiple of projects. The Eclipse Foundation started with the Eclipse project, was very focused on Java development tools and C and C++ development tools. But over the last 19 years now, time flies when you're having fun, we have turned into, I think we could call it an umbrella open source organization. We're no longer tied to any particular technology or platform. We are similar to the Apache Software Foundation in that we have a strong ethos and a idea, like they have the Apache way, we have the Eclipse development process that talks about how we do open source projects. But we have staff and a very sort of professional environment similar to the Linux Foundation. So if you're sort of like if the Apache Software Foundation and the Linux Foundation were to have a child, that might be the Eclipse Foundation. So we're really trying hard to sort of take the best from both of our peers in the open source community. And so we have projects now that we talk about having four main focus areas. Of course, tools for developers is still a main focus area, and we have lots of new development tools like Eclipse Theia and Eclipse Che. But we're also we have the largest open source community for IoT and edge compute. Is another major focus area. We're very involved in cloud native Java, and so we actually now operate the successor to Java, the Java EE specification. And then finally, automotive, which of course is near and dear to the hearts of the European economy, is a big area of focus for us. So, for example, we have on our board we have Mercedes and Bosch, largely because of their interest in what we're doing in automotive.
Hey, I want to jump in if I can and ask, and this may segue to what we want to talk about. Why the move to Europe? I'm really curious what led to that. What was kind of the impetus behind it?
That's a great question. And so it all started at a board meeting in October 2019, just before the pandemic hit. And we had our board member from Bosch said, hey, you guys seem to be doing really well in Europe. You should look at, strategically look at, why that is and what you could do about it. And when we ran the numbers, it was one of those sort of like boil the frog moments where you hadn't noticed something was happening until you actually went and looked. And it turned out that 70% of our paying members and 70% of our committers and projects were European. So we thought about that for a while, and we decided that in addition to that, so we had become European almost without noticing. But in addition to that, we noticed that there was a lot of initiatives like, digital sovereignty and the like that were going to need an open source component to the strategy. And we came to the conclusion that if we didn't become the open source foundation of choice for Europe, somebody else was going to do it because the need was that strong. So we decided to make a commitment to Europe and move our legal domicile. And so we're an international nonprofit association, legally registered in Brussels now. That's our legal home now.
All right. So that is probably a good segue to talk about what we really want to talk about, and that is there's something going on in Europe and in the United States too, and other places around the world, but it's kind of a big deal in Europe, and that is let's get the title exactly right. It's the
Cyber Resilience Act.
Yes, thank you. The Cyber Resilience Act, and it kind of worries a lot of us, because one of the things that it does is it pushes some responsibility onto companies, but also potentially onto individuals that write code. And there's no clear line as, even if someone is doing it as a hobbyist. So open source has this, it's had its moment, and it's everywhere. And so you have people that are hobbyists slinging code for their own little thing. I may write a piece of code because I have 1,000 books over here and I want a way to organize them. Well, I write some code that does that. I put it on GitHub, and the next thing you know, some major library system is pulling little pieces of my code in their stuff. And that's because, we use an open source license, and that's how it works. Well, then what happens if, and this is a weird example, but if that library gets hit by ransomware, and it happens to be a bug that was in my code, and the Cyber Resiliency Act, as well as the executive order that happened here in the United States, there is a possibility that can flow back even to, in this example, to me, the poor developer that doesn't have any money and didn't do this for profit, and suddenly I'm on the hook for some of these damages. So first off, tell me, is my silly little example here, is that the crux of the issue? Is that what you're looking at as a problem? And then take it from there. What's next? What does this look like?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So the first thing I'll say is, no, I don't think that the Cyber Resilience Act would impact the hobbyist. So I don't think that fear is the issue. There is a carve out and a clear intent that the hobbyists, perhaps working for charities, but the people that are just writing code for fun, if you will, I don't think they are implicated in the Cyber Resilience Act. But I think the issue is 98% of open source software, and certainly I'd say close to 100% of the open source software that really matters, isn't the hobbyist. It is, open source now makes up 70 to 90% of the code in, most of the products around the world. Certainly, most of the software products, and that code is is rarely coming from hobbyists, right? The sort of the old stereotype or caricature of open source is, something that somebody does as a hobby from their mom's basement. Hasn't been true for a really, really long time. Kubernetes and Linux and Eclipse and all these projects are being done by professional software developers because they are, and in many cases, either being paid to or are making a living from the software that they're developing. And that's, I think, the issue with the Cyber Resilience Act is that there's what they are targeting is, the phrase that they use in the act is software developed or supplied under a commercial activity. And one of the things that a lot of people have a misunderstanding about is they go, well, okay, so that means that rules out us because we're providing code under the Apache license. That's not commercial, so obviously this doesn't apply to us, right? I can remember reading the Slashdot thread on the Cyber Resilience Act, and a whole lot of the comments were of the ilk will say, this says right here that it's not commercial, and we're not doing commercial, so it doesn't apply to us. Well, the problem is that the phrase commercial activity actually has a specific meaning in European regulations. Mm-hmm. And what it means is it doesn't mean what you think it means, right? So when they say commercial activity, there's a 3-part test: regularity, the characteristics of the product, and the intentions of the person or entity that's making the product. And let's just take the Apache web server, for the Apache HTTP server, for example. It ships on a regular release cadence, right? And it is intended to be used in a commercial setting. People run commercial websites using this. And it has all the characteristics of a robust commercial product, and including security patches and the like. So our read, and I've checked this with a number of different lawyers, both our lawyers and in conversations with others, the consensus opinion of the folks that I'm talking to is most of the all of the important software that we consider in the open source world, whether you're talking Linux, Kubernetes, Apache, Eclipse, Jetty, Tomcat, you name it, they would all fall under the full weight of the Cyber Resilience Act. And so what does that? What do I mean when I say the full weight of the Cyber Resilience Act? So what the Cyber Resilience Act does is regulate the software industry. So it's important to understand that. So I'm here to talk about what this means for open source, but what the Cyber Resilience Act is doing is taking the entire software industry from an unregulated industry to a regulated industry. And by the way, the Europeans are doing this first, but as far as if you read like the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was published by the White House a couple of weeks ago, it has a better carve out for open source, but it's pretty clear that the U.S. government is kind of headed in the same direction. Just this week, the draft text of the Restrict Act was published in the U.S., and it includes open source on the list of technologies that Chinese companies are not going to be allowed to access any longer. I sort of somewhat tongue-in-cheek said the other day that great, we finally convinced governments that open source is important. Oops. So back to, what does the Cyber Resilience Act do? And actually, before I get there, I want to say something that I think is really important. Why is this happening? It's important to understand and recognize that there are good intentions behind these attempts to government by various governments to regulate the software industry. There's been a lot of very well publicized attacks and hacks, some of which have been traced back to open source. So whether you're talking about Equifax and the struts bug, where you're talking Log4j, SolarWinds, like there's a lot of various things that Heartbleed with OpenSSL. There's been a lot of well publicized hacks and exploits, and some of them have been traced back to open source. But even taking open source out of the equation, there's a lot of interest by governments to help the software industry by regulating it. So now, why does this apply to open source? Well, in the case of the Cyber Resilience Act, there is no real carve out for open source. So the weight of the act applies to open source. And what is it doing for software in general? Well, it's saying that all software made available in the European market will need to go through a CE mark conformance assessment. So if you've ever bought, a mobile phone or a radio, if you look on the back, there might be something you see that says CE on it. And that is the mark that is used throughout Europe to say that device has been certified as complying with some set of one or more regulations. So the CE mark has been used historically for regulated devices like radios and stuff, also hazardous devices like boilers and so on. And so I'm going to slightly exaggerate to make a point, but over the next couple of years, software is going to go from a completely unregulated industry to a industry that is being regulated like a hazardous product. And that's going to apply to open source code as well. And so Actually, I could keep rambling for a long time, but maybe I'll just pause there and see if that spurred any questions from either of you.
Oh, I mean, goodness, of course it has. Doc, do you want to go?
Yeah. I want to go back and get that as a pull quote we just said, that we're going from a completely unregulated, it's not even an industry, but I think they imagine it's an industry, to being treated as a hazardous product. When it's a little bit like saying we're going to start regulating gravity here because everybody uses it and it's really important. So we're going to tell you what you're going to do with gravity. Or what people do with gravity. It's just, and yet because people don't understand software, I think, and that's really kind of a critical thing. There was a former FCC chairman, I wouldn't say who, and may have mentioned this on a show before, who, when a group of us were talking to him about net neutrality as a concept, a bunch of people who were very pro net neutrality as a concept anyway, not necessarily as something you needed to regulate. He said, I have talked to everybody in Congress, and I could tell you almost to a person, there are two things none of them know anything about. One is economics, and the other is technology. Good luck, okay? Because they're going to want to regulate these things. And fortunately, the U.S. does not have it nearly as together at the bureaucratic level as Europe does, or any of the sort of the larger countries in Europe. So what's the hope here? Here's a question I might have is, what are you working, lobbying clueful people in here saying, excuse me, but this is absurd over here, what you're trying to do, and we really want to help you with it? And also, what is it like? I'm going back to this conference where every single session, there, we have no panels, we have no keynotes, it's all breakouts on any topic. So if I go back in there today and say, I want to have a session on the CRA, and I'm recruiting people, and we have a lot of Europeans here. We got Germany, France, Czech Republic, a lot of them. And some are going back over to the Enterprise Identity Conference in Berlin. I may even be going there next month. What do we tell them? What do we do? What do you do? What are you doing, and what do we do, whoever we are? Because we're software geeks. We want to make something happen.
Yeah, so one of the most important things to understand is, so you sort of nailed it. There's a lot of what's going on here is based on a misunderstanding of both the technology and the economics of software. And, good intentions are great, but getting it right is important to the future prosperity and innovation of Europe. And worldwide. So we're obviously very motivated to try to fix this. Unfortunately, one of the things to understand is where we are at this point in the process in Europe is this is now in the realm of politics. So the way their process works is the Commission has drafted a piece of legislation, and that's been now submitted to the two decision-making bodies, the Parliament and the Council. And so there's, as you'd expect, there's parliamentary committees, similar to congressional committees that are reviewing the text and, seeking advice on potential amendments and the like. And so what we're doing is we are reaching out to members of European Parliament, to representatives of the member states in the Council, and we're which is unprecedented in my career and certainly in the history of the Eclipse Foundation, and I think in most open source foundations. We are now in the realm of politics and lobbying, which is that's entirely new and honestly somewhat uncomfortable territory for us, but that's where we are. And we're telling everybody that we can, including our own member companies, we're telling everybody that we can get to listen to us, that they in turn need to lobby, that the Cyber Resilience Act is, so first of all, the fact that it's regulating the entire software industry is a very, very big deal. And it's important to keep that in mind. But what it's doing to the open source community has the potential to I don't want to, I'm trying to think of the right word because I don't want to exaggerate here. It has the potential to do enormous harm to what has been the most innovative process ever devised by man. And I say that it's the way that open source works today with the free flow of ideas implemented in software is incredible. As in the original definition of the incredible, as in it defies credibility, right? It's beautiful to see how software is developed in the open, how it evolves quickly, and then how it is commercialized. And if harm is done to that process through any of the regulatory processes, whether they start in Europe or the US or China or anywhere else, it will do great harm to the future prosperity of the entire human race. Because if you look at everything that's happened in the last 20 years, in terms of how we've moved society forward, that is being driven by software, and that's now in I think at great threat. And one of the example that I used in a conversation the other day that I think that the World Wide Web was invented at CERN by Tim Berners-Lee. And if a similar situation happened a couple of years from now, the inventor of the web would have to get a CE mark, do a CE mark assessment for his code before he could make it available and share it with his friends. And, or certainly share it with anybody who would have an interest in commercializing it. And if you think about what a dampening effect that would have on innovation, I think that is, it frightens me, and I hope it frightens others.
So I want to jump in and ask, I've got, fittingly, a Raspberry Pi, and it's got, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, right there. It's got a CE mark on it.
Sure.
And so that means on a piece of hardware that they have, tested it to failure, right? So they've turned it on and they've put it in an oven and they've run it up to probably 100 degrees Celsius and sees what happens. They've shorted all the various pins. They've given it too much voltage. They've tested this thing. There's a laboratory somewhere that has, a bunch of copies of this. They've tested it to failure and they make sure that it doesn't explode catastrophically, right? That's essentially what a CE mark means for a piece of hardware, right?
Yep. The CE mark might be there on primarily because of the Wi-Fi radios and the like.
So sure.
There could, but the analogy is correct.
Sure. Okay. What does a CE mark mean for software then? What does this process even look like? Are we talking about a full security audit? Which I mean is great. Don't get me wrong. There's a part of me that says, let's do this. I would love to see Microsoft have to get Windows fully audited before they can sell another copy in the European Union. Like there's a very, very evil part of me that's just gleeful at that. But at the same time, I understand what a disaster that would be for all of us.
Yeah. So, okay. So, and by the way, I just want to warn you in advance that I have personally deeply rat-holed on this topic over the last couple of months. I've read the CRA from front to back. I've studied it up and down. So I apologize. Stop me if I start getting too deep on this. But okay. So here's what a potential future world looks like. So the CRA basically regulates what they call all products with digital elements, including pure software. So it's not just about embedded devices like the Raspberry Pi or the webcam you have in your house. It includes pure software, and so there's three classes of products with digital elements: products with digital elements, critical products with digital elements, and highly critical products with digital elements. And there's annexes which define these three things. But just to give you an example of a critical product with digital elements, it would be an operating system intended for a desktop or a mobile phone. So that's a highly critical product with digital elements. An example of that's a critical product. An example of a highly critical product is an operating system other than one for a desktop or a mobile phone. So think of an operating system like Zephyr that's intended for IoT. That would be an example of a highly critical product. So with critical or highly critical products, before you can make the product available in the European Union in the future, you will have to get a CE mark affixed to it by working with an external auditor from what's called a notifying body. So think of TÜV in Germany as TÜV Süd or one of those, in the US it would be like the equivalent of the underwriter's laboratory kind of approach. And this external auditor would have to validate that the product had been built with in conformance with the standards expected for a product of that type. And I've never gone through this process. I've been told anecdotally that for a piece of hardware, it can take, as much as, for actually extreme example, a medical device, of which of course we all want to be super safe and super secure. It can take on the order of 12 months and, €1 million to get a CE mark for it. So I don't even understand how this will work in the software case, because the volume of release cadence is typically measured in months, not years. And the other thing I just want to mention is that in the past, CE mark conformance there's been a European harmonized, for every previous example of CE mark conformance, there has been a European harmonized standard that if you follow that standard, you have a presumption of conformance. Well, there is no standard in existence that I'm aware of that describes software development in general. So in the case of secure software development, there's things like the NIST SSDF, but even that is sort of like a portfolio of other standards that you need to go and look at and implement in order to fully conform. So the disaster scenario, in my mind, is imagine a world a couple of years from now where to ship a software product in Europe, you need to conform to a CE mark that is based on a standard that has not yet been written, that will require an external auditor to verify that you conform to the standard that has not yet been written. I'm not sure how that's going to work out in the real world.
I have lots of follow-up questions. I want to start with this one though. And this is just kind of my personal hobby opinion, and I'm curious whether you agree. I am not convinced that it's possible to write a standard that would actually result in bulletproof code or bulletproof software products. I have seen so many oddball security vulnerabilities. Yeah. I'm just not convinced that anything less than you must be formally mathematically verified, which there are a couple of projects that are out there looking to do that. But anything less than that, I'm just not convinced that it would be possible to write the sort of standard that would actually make much of a difference. Is it? What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, so I've been in the software. I'm older than Doc thinks I am. I've been in the software business for 40 years. A long time ago, part of my early career was working at Northern Telecom with building developer tools for the people that build telecommunications equipment. And they're basically, with the equipment that they were building, had a mean time between failure of 25 years, which is, anybody who's been involved in the software business in any way knows that that's extraordinary, even to aspire to, never mind achieve. And yet, there was no standard that was generally applicable to how you did that. So, I mean, I share your concern that it seems implausible that such a standard could be made. But so actually, I think we're kind of diving down one particular rat hole, but just maybe I'll just pop the stack and give you another example of the kinds of things that are in the CRA. Two that come to mind that I think anybody who's involved in open source or software in general will twig is the CRA in its current form says that you are not permitted to publish intermediate builds of your software unless they're marked as for testing purposes only and provided under licenses that make sure that you couldn't actually deploy that into a product. And so, thinking from the Eclipse Foundation, it's like all of our projects do nightly builds at least, and our nightly builds are published under open source licenses that allow any use for any purpose at any time. And I don't know, and this has been sort of de facto best practices for open source software development with CI/CD for as long as I've been around. And so the notion that would be prohibited by law seems, shall we say, interesting. Another phrase, just one sentence buried deep in the midst of the CRA that I think software professionals would find interesting is it says you are not permitted to ship any product with a known exploitable vulnerability, which, if interpreted literally, means you can't publish. I don't know. Well, I guess known. I mean, but there's no. The thing is, there's no analysis of the risk, right? So there's lots of times where software gets published where there might be a known exploitable vulnerability, but the risk is deemed to be so low that it doesn't prevent it from being shipped. There's a lot of little gems like that in the Cyber Resilience Act that need to be fixed, and we have suggestions on how to fix all of these, but we're focused on the open source part of this. Obviously, others will have to take up the mantle of arguing for software in general.
I know Doc has some questions he wants to ask about the fallout from this, particularly in Europe. But I want to tell you about something else real quick before we go there, and that is Club TWiT. Goodness, you should be on Club TWiT, and that's the membership program we have at twit.tv, and it is a incredibly reasonable $7 a month, and that gets you shows ad-free. That gets you access to the members-only Discord, and that gets you access to a handful of members-only shows. We have Hands on Mac, Hands on Windows, and the show that I get to host, the Untitled Linux Show. If you would like to think of that at Hands on Linux, it's about the same thing, but we're the open source folks. We had to have a bit more fun name, and so we're the Untitled Linux Show, and we would love to see you there. But even more importantly, we would love to see you as a part of Club TWiT. Go check it out and sign up today. And Doc, why don't you take it there? And I know you want to ask about this. Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, boy, I have so many thoughts. One of them, a cynical one, is would we be able to have this show in Europe after this thing passes? Because it seems to have so many unintended and naive and ill-informed and other possible downstream consequences, but one of them is it? I mean, what happens if companies or developers of all kinds? Because what I think the muggles of the world, which I take bureaucrats to be, don't recognize about open source wizards, is that rules for the natural world don't apply in the digital one. Many of them, and it's simply impossible to regulate some of these things. And it's a good thing that it's impossible. But once you try, suddenly, let's say the CE mark is required on every damn thing there is. What if companies and developers just boycott it, and Europe does, Europe sits there in the past waiting for bureaucrats to approve stuff and gets left out. Is that a possibility? Is that a real serious possibility?
Well, I want to say this. So everything I've been talking about so far is based on the original draft of the CRA, and I'm quite confident that the final law that is eventually passed is going to be different than what we have here. But the history of the CRA is, as I understand it, was that it was a reaction to effectively shoddy consumer IoT devices. And again, as I understand it, product law in Europe and the way most regulations have always been written have assumed that what you're talking about is a physical device. And I think a lot of the truly worrisome implications of the CRA arise from extending these kinds of regulations from out past cyber physical goods into pure software. And so, if the CRA was limited to cyber physical goods, and it was limited to applying to the companies that are monetizing the open source, as opposed to the open source projects and communities themselves that are, operating on a shoestring on a nonprofit basis. If those two things were true, then I think at least arguably you're doing something, that will help consumers, and perhaps, I could understand the sort of the net benefits of this. It's what in its current form, what it's doing is it's extending it to all software, including pure software, and it's extending it across the whole value chain, right? So it's the upstream projects are going to have to get the CE mark when it's in its current form as a nonprofit. So the Eclipse Foundation would have to get the CE mark on its projects. And then the first thing that happens is some company picks that up and wants to put it into a product, and then they have to get the CE mark on their product. The difference, of course, being that companies make money on their products. And I think one of the misunderstandings on an economic basis is that as it relates to open source is that companies can make an economic decision to certify a product, because they can, if all else fails, they can pass the cost along in the price that they charge their consumers. Open source is free. It's both, free as in free speech, but also free as in royalty free. So if organizations like Eclipse and Apache and Mozilla and so on are expected to continue to supply free software, and all of a sudden we have an order of magnitude greater costs, a rational economic response could be, you can't use this software in Europe. And that is, I'm fairly certain that that's not the intended consequence of the CRA, but it would be a logical response. Brian, a guy named Brian Fox, who's works at a company called Sonatype, who runs Maven Central, which is the central repository of Java artifacts that everybody uses when they're building Java programs. Used out in a blog post back in December about, if the CRA was to pass in its current form, shutting off Maven Central or NPM, PyPy, those kinds of repository centers, shutting off access to Europe would be a perfectly rational result, because who wants to assume liability for something that you're giving away for free?
I've got to jump in and ask real quick. There's a potential problem here. doesn't the GPL and a bunch of other licenses expressly prohibit turning off access because of where someone is at?
So the interesting thing is, I think a lot of open source developers put a lot more credence to what's in the license than is actually fact. So, for example, every open source license has a clause that says, we're not accepting any liability and we're not giving you any warranty. Mm-hmm. Well, the fact of the matter is that there are laws that say that you are accepting some liability and you might be providing, in certain circumstances, might have an implied warranty, whether you write it in your license or not. And the same is true for, you cannot ignore export controls. So if you write a piece of software in the US and the government decides to ITAR it, you can't export it whether it's open source or not. I mean, that's just the way it is. And the same thing is true. If Europe passes these regulations, it doesn't matter what it says in the license. You have to comply with the law. Or put it another way, you can't contract away the law.
Yeah, but what does that do then to the contract? Does the open source license survive at all?
Most open source licenses, if they're longer than the MIT or BSD, will have a severance clause, that says if any portion of this document, this is a pretty standard contract term, if any portion of this contract is deemed invalid, the rest of the document still applies. But and I am not a lawyer.
We started with that. None of us are.
Yeah. So but but I've hung around with a lot of lawyers. So I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. But I think my lawyer friends would say that I'm not too wrong.
All right. Before I hand it back over to Doc, I want to ask one more thing, and that is there anything in the CRA that you actually like? And I will give an example because I've looked into this some. One of the things that I really like that they put in there is you need to have a contact address for vulnerability reporting. I cannot tell you how many times I've covered stories where, lone researcher finds a really big problem in some piece of software, tries to disclose it, and can't find a disclosure address. And I just love the fact that we just make this little note that says, hey, if you're going to sell software, you need to put an email address out there so that a security researcher can get a hold of you. I think that's a good idea. Is there anything else in there that you actually like?
Yes. By the way, it's sunset here in Brussels, so I'm getting this weird glow on the side of my head. Apologize. There's a bunch of really good stuff. That's a good example. Just the simple fact that if you ship a product with software, as long as you keep that product in the market, you're responsible for doing security fixes. That's not a bad idea. And there's lots of good stuff in there along those lines. But again, the concern is kind of going from. I actually agree philosophically with the idea that the software industry, the tech industry, we've had a really great run for 50 some years, whatever, is a completely unregulated industry. I could get behind the idea that some modicum of regulation is appropriate, and things like making sure that if you have a product that there's a place where you can report a vulnerability, and making sure that security patches are available for some reasonable amount of time, or as you keep the product in the field. These are not crazy ideas, and maybe the time has come to put those into some form of regulation. But going from where we are today, which is as a completely unregulated industry, to what could be a heavily regulated industry in a pretty short period of time, seems kind of frightening. And by the way, along those lines, when in the preamble of the CRA, where the commission wrote its analysis of documented its motivations for this and where it came from. One of the things that really caught my attention was they estimated that the costs of implementing the CRA as 29 billion euros annually. And I think that's off by, my gut says that's off by at least 2 orders of magnitude. And, time will tell whether the commission is right or I'm right, but this feels like an extremely expensive proposition, the way it's currently written.
So we are our back channel, both the actual back channel and our own back channel between Jonathan and me has been very active on this one. We could go 3 hours, is one of the things you were saying. Easily, we could go days, and there's so many questions. And I'm looking here. I actually broke out some things you said. There's topics: IoT, edge, tools, open source communities, cloud native, Java, and automotive. And that doesn't even cover, a question: the Eclipse Open VSX marketplace for VS Code extensions. I mean, there are so many things we could touch on here, but the sort of encompassing one I'd just like to lay on you is there one thing that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to visit quickly before the end of the show?
Trying to think of which of the many things I could say right now. I'll pick. So I think closing thought for the audience, and I'm assuming that most of the audience here are people that come from a technology background and have some love for software and a love for open source. I think the thing to understand is that we have all been focused on our keyboards, writing code and making we think the world a better place through software. You have to start paying attention to the regulatory environment that's coming our way. This requires a level of activism, for a lack of a better phrase. That this is to be clear, for me personally, for our members, for our projects, for our community, this is an all hands on deck kind of situation. To not only try to shape the regulatory environment so that it doesn't kill the goose that's laid the golden eggs for the last couple of decades, to make sure that the regulatory environment is feasible, but also to make sure that at the same time, we are making the world a better place. And I think we can do both, but it's going to involve a lot of people that have never really been engaged with politics and regulation and these kinds of things before in their lives. That I count myself in that camp. I've never been involved in anything like this before in my career or in my life. But this is something that I think is extremely important, and both for our industry, but also for our societies and our economies. This is a really big deal.
I just had a thought, and I want to get your thoughts on it. What has the European Union unleashed now that they are forcing millions of geeks and nerds around the world who, generally speaking, would love to stay out of politics, kind of forcing our hand and forcing us to get into politics? That's going to have sort of a knock-on effect in other areas, don't you think? This could be sort of transformational.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so in a good way. And we've seen this in action. Unfortunately, I wasn't at FOSDEM this year. I'm not sure if you're familiar with FOSDEM, but it's a fantastic event if you've never been. It's the European open source developers event. It's held in Brussels every first weekend in February every year. And some of the people from the commission who are here in Brussels came and gave a talk on the CRA. And I think they, as I wasn't there, but I was, because my son got married that weekend, but I was told by a lot of people that a lot of passion was exhibited in the room when developers understood that open source was in the crosshairs, and just actually one thing I haven't mentioned before that's important to understand is the inclusion of open source in the CRA was not an accident.
Right.
I think it's particularly misguided, and I think it's a misunderstanding of the consequences is a part of what's driving this. But with good intentions, they decided that open source needed to fall within the realm of regulation. And I'm sure your audience will agree with me that that's a mistake.
It's just amen to that. We're at an inflection point here, and it's a pretty big one. And it covers a lot of territory, and we have to have you back. We say that to almost everybody, but some stuff's going to happen here, and I can't think of anybody who's more informed or at the front, as it were, on this fight for all of us, the many thousands that listen to us. We have thousands of listeners, and over 12,000, as a matter of fact, and have been with us for 16 years. It's substantial, so maybe they can be active on this too. It's a wake-up call. We always close with two questions, which are, what are your favorite text editor and scripting language? This is a very technical question. And it could be that your text editor is a bullet from I don't know.
So first I have to confess that my programming days have been behind me for quite some time. But I did spend a lot of time with fooling around with Raspberry Pis and the like. I'd say that just from that, favorite text editor is, I don't laugh, but Nano, and favorite scripting language is Python. Although
that's great. Well, when you mentioned Brian Fox earlier, I was wondering if that's the same Brian Fox who invented Bash, the Bash shell. Is it possible?
Don't think so.
Okay, there's a fairly common name. He's been on the show too. I recommend people go back and listen to that and recognize it has nothing to do with today's show. It's just worth listening to. Anyway, so Mike, thanks so much, man. This has been great. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Good evening there. Well, we're still having a morning back here in the West Coast, U.S.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing what folks think when they spend a little time reading up on the CRA themselves and understanding, where this is all headed.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, man. So, Jonathan, that was rock and roll, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I have this thought. One of the things that I find really neat is to read back kind of the history of hacking and the history of sort of our industry and where all these things started. And one of the things that you find pretty often is a lot of these roots go all the way back, like to the phone phreakers, sort of one of the root streams of open source. And it's always kind of this nostalgic feeling because there was a day before some laws passed that phone phreaking was totally legal and you could have a blue box and you could do all those things. And then the laws got passed and people started getting arrested. And there's this sort of nostalgic feeling about the good old days of playing with the phone system. And I have this feeling that we may one of these days look back and think of these days as being the good old days where just anybody could do stuff with open source and software, but laws got passed that messed it up for everybody. And I hope that's not the case, but I just have this feeling that we are at a point of change and things will never quite be the same.
Well, the freedom that Mike was talking about that we all operate in and we still take for granted a great deal. Freedom from regulatory not just capture, but just regulatory drag. I'm thinking about, he mentioned that a lot came out of Tim Berners-Lee and his work. Well, Tim and a bunch of high energy physicists went to the phone companies in Europe and said, do you mind if we use this thing TCP/IP to run HTTP over? Because that's our little protocol that we use to share documents. And that was a Trojan horse inside every phone company on earth. And nobody knew it, right? And had regulators been on top of that, regulators are totally captive of the phone companies, would they ever have allowed it? They never would have. They would have. What are the tariffs we could get on this? We can. Where can we put the gates at national borders? They never did that. And there's just so much that isn't appreciated about the way hacking works. And even things like the GPL. We want other people to have the same freedom with this that we do. There's nothing like it in the traditional corporate world, the natural world. Even it's kind of weird, but. Yeah,
I guess.
Hey, Mike. Go ahead. We'll pretend the show's not over.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry. It's like saying
I can't resist it.
I got attracted into open source because I was what really motivated me to take this job almost 20 years ago now was I was really interested in how hacker communities over the internet could do so much cool stuff. And that was, but I was looking at it from a business perspective. That's where I came from. I was, and what I've evolved to over the last 19 years is to realize that the vision of free software is also amongst its other attributes is just a way better way to do business. And that's, part of the reason why open source has taken over the world is because it just makes so many things more efficient and effective. And it's, that freedom has been a huge benefit to so many aspects of society.
So we're way over time, so I have to quickly end the show. We get to hang out though. So Jonathan, what do you want to plug real quick? You got Hackaday, I know for sure.
Sure. We plugged the Untitled Linux show on Club TWiT. The other thing I want to mention is over at Hackaday, we cover lots of stuff on Hackaday, but I kind of take the security and open source beats there. And so you can check out my work, all 284 articles worth. Goodness, that's a bunch. But every Friday, the security column goes live, and that's just the things in the security world that I found interesting throughout the week. And then we also cover things like the CRA, and so follow my work there and keep up with me. It's a blast.
And thanks so much. I have to quickly check who we have on next week. Where is the schedule? Quickly, there it is. Okay, it was, and now it is. I don't know. Okay, we have somebody. Oh no, Stormy Peters, is that next week? Yeah, it's Stormy Peters. Okay, Stormy's very cool. She's great. Now the back channel's telling me Stormy Peters. So Stormy Peters is going to be on, and she's great. And we'll see you then. In the meantime, be sure to evangelize the show. I think it's a really important one. And we'll see you next week.
It's midweek, and you really want to know even more about the world of technology.
So you should check out Tech News Weekly, the show where we talk to and about the people making and breaking the tech news.
It's the biggest news. We talk with the people writing the stories that you're probably reading. We also talk between ourselves about the stories that are getting us even more excited about tech news this week.
So if you're excited, well, then join us. Head to twit.tv/TNW to subscribe.